think the only major flaw would be for a kit like this is a fantastic way. I don't know if like I love the kits or if I hate the kits. If you ever wanted to try your hand at dyeing your own yarn, but you didn't want to make a huge investment on any of the supplies required, stick around because today I'm testing out if I can dye this yarn with this Easter egg kit. In order to dye your own yarn with what is essentially food coloring, you'll have to consider the three main types of commercially available yarn, and those are going to be your proteins, your cellulose, and your synthetic fibers. Now, your protein-based yarns are going to be things like sheep's wool, goat, that sort of stuff. Cellulose is going to be your stuff like cottons and bamboos, things that are plant-based. And finally, your synthetic yarns are, the plasticky ones are going to be your acrylics, polyesters, nylons, that sort of thing. Now, your protein-based yarns are going to be the types of yarn bases that are going to take the dye the best. And cellulose can be a little bit harder to dye, or you might have to let it sit longer, or you'll get like a paler, more muted tone typically. And then finally, your synthetic fibers typically are pretty impossible to impart color on, especially with something as simple as a food grade dye. And the one possible exception to that is going to be your nylon, which is why I do think that nylon is one of the most popular synthetic fibers that you'll see with like socks. You just want to help so bad. And I think that's why nylon is such a popular choice to pair with stuff like merino, so that way it adds that stability and resilience, but then it will also easily take on the dye process and give you a more consistent color than, say, if you were to pair merino with a polyester or acrylic. Not to say that it can't be done, it's just a totally different process. In the past, I have successfully dyed wool yarns with food color in the past. At the time, I used those gel jar type of food colors, and then you're left over with so much of that food coloring. So if you're not sure whether or not you're going to enjoy the dyeing process, this would be a fantastic way to go if it actually works out today. The other problem with that little jar of food coloring is if I'm not using it in baking or anything like that, even if I wanted to use it for other things, there's something really messy about those, and the jars just, even if you think you get it clean, I swear the green got on everything. It even, like, if I looked at it, I was going to get green on it. And this was from at least 10 years ago, and there is still these tiny little green flecks on my mixer, and it drives me crazy to this day because every time I think I get it all out, I don't. I think that's why these color tabs are going to be so much simpler for the purpose of having a more contained dye. I'm probably going to change out of this into something I really don't care when I actually get to the dyeing portion of this. So keep that in mind because it is color, it could stain. I thought this would be a fun way to try like a bite-sized version of, trying out the dye process if this is another hobby that you want to add to your yarning arsenal of skills. So whether you want a budget-friendly way to try this out, or your kids decided they're too cool for dyeing Easter eggs this year, or maybe you're just kind of like, I want to keep the tradition of dyeing eggs, but the cost of eggs right now is just more than you want to spend for, an afternoon of fun, but you also want to keep the tradition alive, and you can, I don't know, maybe this is a new tradition, dyeing yarn together with your kids. I don't know. I don't have kids. They might think this is the lamest thing on the face of the planet. Now, obviously you could probably get away with just one of these 98-cent kits. It does come with 6 colors. So I thought that was actually pretty generous, but I did pick up a few kits, and the other one I picked up is the Classic Paws brand. This includes 9 colors. So I don't know, not necessarily, a wow value, other than there's also like stickers and some other stuff in here. And if you just want those extra colors, that might be worth spending a little bit more to you. And then for some reason, I talked myself into getting the $4 kit, even though it has fewer colors than the one with 9. That was only $1.98. This was $3.98. Yeah, $3.98 at Walmart. There's other stuff in here, glitter, all that other stuff that you could do with eggs if that's what you were doing. But honestly, I really just wanted the speckle tab that's in here, so that's a me problem that I wanted to spend $4 to see what the speckle tab is going to do with yarn. So I don't know, I guess it just depends. And then anything I don't use, I'll probably just give to the kids next door. Now the yarn I did select today was out of my stash. This is Kramer Natural Skeins. This one is Jeannie, and I believe this one is Wilma, even though I did lose the ball band, or maybe it didn't have one at all. Both of these I got on clearance when a local yarn shop was closing for, I believe, a retirement or something. This was a while back, so these have been in my stash for some time. Kramer is still around in Nazareth, Pennsylvania, so you could obviously pick any kind of yarn base from them if you want. Knit Picks has a lot of great bear yarn options, including bear hair, so if you wanted to play around with Angora, that would be super fun. And if you just want to pick something up quickly, Patton's Classic Wool is available at Michael's, and you could even start out with a different yarn base just to see what that would turn out like, but their colorway Aran is more like this, so that's probably going to take dye the best if that's what you want. Now, before I go ahead and just drop this into some of the prepared dye, there are a few steps that I'm going to take ahead of time to make sure that the color imparts as well as possible in this scenario, especially since these are not professional dyes, they're food dyes, and there's nothing wrong with that by any stretch of the imagination, but it can add some more steps, and I guess I don't know enough about commercial grade stuff to know what kind of steps are involved in that. But for this, I am going to pre-soak these in hot but not boiling water for about 15 minutes or so with some vinegar. That's going to help loosen up the hair shaft. So if you're someone who's ever gone to the salon and had your hair colored, maybe the colorist had kind of explained this to you, that you want to go ahead and open up that hair shaft, and then that's going to help impart the color molecules in with the yarn. It's not going to just sit on top. Because I want to try several of the colors and across the two brands of kits, I am going to have to take some care to split this off carefully and then also tie them so that it doesn't just become a wad of tangled spaghetti in those bowls while they're soaking and while they're in the dye process. And you'll make sure you want to like tie those circles loosely so that way, you know, you're not creating white spots or undyed spots, at least under whatever you're using to tie that off. You can either use some of the yarn from here or some other scrap yarn that you have laying around would be totally fine, even if it's acrylic, because you're not trying to dye the acrylic. But again, just make sure you're not tying it too tight and you're leaving enough room for the water and dye to get into there. And so that's going to go ahead and soak for about 15 minutes. And for the kits themselves, I'm going to go ahead and prepare them as directed on the box instructions, just because, I mean, they made it, they know how it works. And then it does say, and this is also true, is the longer you keep your egg, or in this case, yarn, in the dye, the deeper the color will be, or the more saturated it will become. The other thing to keep in mind is that we will also need to set the color, because presumably you want the color to stay and last for, you know, whatever the use is that you're going to wear this, or whatever the case is. And as you're knitting it, you don't want it to just come off on your hands. So at the end, we'll set everything. And the best thing to set these food colors are going to be in, again, a simmering pot, not boiling, because you don't want to felt the yarn. That would be totally tragic. And that will be about a 45-minute soak on the stove. The nice thing about these being food grade colors is that you can use whatever you have in your kitchen. You don't have to worry about having separate supplies that you would have to have for the jacquard dyes. You're not going to want to use the same stuff that you use every day in the kitchen. Once you use those jacquard acid dyes in a pot, it is no longer food safe. So that is one of the benefits of using food color over one of those acid dyes. Now, if you decide you want to use a fancier hand painting technique on your yarn and do a variegated or flashes of color or whatever you want to do with that, instead of soaking it while it's simmering, what you would want to do then is just go ahead and use a steamer mesh thing. Just steam it for 45 minutes to help set the color in the spots where they are and avoid any kind of bleeding or running or anything like that. And now I'm really excited to see what I end up with at the end of this. Like I mentioned before, I did go ahead and split off the undyed yarn into several different little mini skeins. And for this, I stuck with just the Wilma for the initial test, and I just chose 3 colors to compare across both the dye kits. So there's the Dye Works for 98 cents, and then the Paz Classic one that we know of for $1.98. And so I did side by side pink, yellow, and blue, because I just figured those would be like the best comparisons, like sort of in primary, which pink isn't really like primary, but I don't know, it's more fun than red. So I went ahead and did that and made these little skeins. This is one that I did not touch yet. I stuck with the yarn base Wilma from the Kramer yarns on that one. And I'm glad I tested another skein from it because this one was full of so many like factory knots and flaws and things like that. So I wasn't too happy about that, but I did in the meantime also at least wind up the genie, and that one was totally fine, no issues whatsoever. This just happened to be a case of, I don't know, just a bad run or just one bad skein in the whole lot, and I happened to be, you know, the one that got it. So luckily I did get it on clearance, probably for like $4 or $5, if that. So, and that was for the whole skein. When I weighed the skeins, they were actually 105 grams, which actually would give me 7 15-gram little mini skeins. I don't know, it just made sense in my mind, I guess. Let's go ahead and talk through the two comparisons that I ended up with. So I will say initially I thought the Dye Works took the pink the best and that the paws had a lot of unevenness, but now that the Dye Works has also had a chance to set and dry, I'm seeing about the same amount of unevenness, but it is still a very pretty tonal color, and I'm going to be so like glad to use it in something. I don't know what yet. I should have really thought that part through of like, what am I actually going to make with these, but I will come up with something probably Easter related. I'm gonna make little peeps. Yeah, my mom loves peeps anyway, so I'm gonna go ahead and make little, I guess, plushy peeps. The yellow, I think both across the board were totally fine. Those came out great. And one thing I noticed is that on the pink for both of them, the color was completely taken up by the yarn. There was absolutely none left after it sat for just a few minutes and the water ran totally clear. There was a little bit of yellow still left in the water, so it took on the dye it needed to take on out of the yellow before I went ahead and set it. And I did let them sit for quite a bit of time. And then the blue, I think, I don't know which one turned out the best. It's hard to say because this little mini skein turned out to be one of the Nightmare ones from the Wilma base. And I don't know. So I don't even know if this is even usable anymore. I don't know if I have the patience to untangle it, to be perfectly honest. But everything else I think turned out super well. I think the only major flaw would be for a kit like this is if these are 15-gram lots of yarn and it took up essentially most or all of the dye that was in that little tablet. If you wanted to do a full skein in one color, this might not be the best way to go. However, if you want to do something like this with little mini skeins just to play around or make granny squares, or in my case, little peeps or something like that, I think it's totally fine for these little projects. Or if you wanted to do a hand painted something or speckles or anything like that, which let's talk about the speckle tab. I chose not to do the speckle tab because after I read the directions, it's basically taking a little paintbrush, like you dissolve the dye tablet and then just like splatter it all over. And I'm like, well, yeah, I knew I could do that. I was hoping the speckle tab itself was going to do something like way more fun without all the extra effort. So I was a little disappointed in that, and maybe that was on me for not like going through all the directions if they were available in any of the listing online to see like how that actually works. So I mean, $4 for curiosity, I think it was worth it. Plus now I have the extra dye tabs to play around with. And then I'll figure out what to do with this. This is also one of the little mini skeins with a lot of imperfection in it, which is one of the reasons why I held this out of the dye pot. And I didn't think the other one was that bad until it just got, it got frustratingly tangled. So that was disappointing, but again, the other yarn base looks like it's going to be totally fine, and I'm actually going to play around with the rest of that tonight and do some fun little things. The other thing I know I mentioned that you could do is over dyeing on a different color of, you know, basically wool color. So wool doesn't just come in like this kind of sheep color, it comes in all sorts of colors, even naturally. And I did, you know, use my brain and I marked on there that there's now only 140 grams of this Cascade Yarns 150 instead of the 150 grams. And I played around with like a blue kind of, I think I used a blue and then I mixed in, I couldn't quite tell what the color tablet was, if it was supposed to be a bluish purple or whatever. Even after I mixed it up, it just seemed like I don't know, sometimes the dye took differently, or in the tablet it was hard to tell, and they give you instructions on how to like figure out why, say, an orangish looking tablet actually, you know, when you do a little swatch of it is green. It's super fun, don't get me wrong, but it could also be a little bit frustrating. So keep in mind, this is super just for fun. Don't go in expecting like some perfection thing, but using that blue on this gray base, I think produced a very pretty kind of navy, I don't know what to call this, but it is, I really like it. The reason that there is a little bit of tonality on this is I left it in a loose version like this instead of undoing the skein and getting it a little bit more even on that. Everything else I had dyed as if it wasn't in here. I, you know, try to do as evenly as possible, putting it into the little dye containers that I was using, which were just, you know, glass food storage containers. So I think this turned out really nice. Obviously not a color for a little Easter peep, but I'll find something. And then the other thing, if you really wanted to play around with, is, I don't know if you remember my yarn that was left over from the Stella fingerless gloves. So it has that very pretty pink and then the green. And I went and chose, oh, it was before I took a little bit of the blue from this because I figured, well, you're going to have to kind of remember a little bit of color theory and color mixing. So I had the pink in that yarn, there's white, and then the green. Well, I didn't want to use more pink because then the green would probably turn brown. Same for if I had used purple, I was concerned that it might turn like a brown or gray for that green. And then one of my other options might have been yellow. So I could do, the pink would turn a more corally or orangey kind of color. And then maybe the green would turn, you know, I guess more of a yellow greeny color. I don't know exactly what that, like a leafy green, I guess. But I had the blue already mixed up and I wanted to save the yellow and the green for, I pulled off a little bit of a mini skein from the Genie yarn base. And I have a thought of what I want to do with that. And then, so this is actually what that turned out as. So as you can see, using blue made the purple and then made the green a more bluish green. So just for reference, this turned into this just by adding blue. So if I wanted to make a second pair of those Stella mitts, but you know, in different colors, I could absolutely do that, and I might. Now, this would be the argument for if I wanted to go ahead and play with the gel food colors and put up with the mess and understanding I might have a little bit left over, that would be more than enough food color to cover an entire skein. Obviously, you might want to play around with like how strong or how diluted you want your colors to be. That's why doing a little swatch like this is a great idea. So for the purpose of a full skein of yarn, the little color tablets that come in an Easter egg kit probably aren't the best solution, but if you just want to play around or have multicolored yarn or variegated options, I think it's super fun. Or if you just want to play around with it for the sake of playing around and not get too hung up on it, that's one thing I do appreciate about dyeing is you don't always 100% know. I mean, unless you're a professional dyer and you have your like set recipes and stuff like that. But just for the beginner, like go into it with like, and I'm just going to play with this mindset. I think as adults in particular, we kind of forget to just have fun and play with things. And I think this is a fantastic way to play with colors and dyes and yarn. You can play along with your kids if they're doing Easter eggs this year. I had kind of a blast doing this, to be honest. And I mean, so much so that I'm going to do some more tonight. I'll be sure to update you with whatever I end up creating tonight. Well, this is sort of what I wanted. And a little bit of it is kind of on me. And this is part of the learning curve of dyeing and why maybe let go a little bit of my expectations or your expectations if you decide to also participate in this great experiment. So for this last mini skein, I did what I did before, which is made sure it was soaked in vinegar. However, I was hoping for like a tonal kind of effect with the main color. And so I had it twisted up still in the skein, except that I misjudged how tightly to do that, or I thought it was relatively loose. And it seemed like dye was getting into all the spots that I wanted it to get into. but that actually wasn't the case. But I also don't think I'm mad at it. And also, this isn't the end of the world because I could always do another round of dyeing if I need to. I did have it twisted up a little bit tighter than I wanted it to be. And so I guess I'll just show you what I ended up with. And I did want the splashes of green. I wanted those to be solid and not have the white. And I think the white spots, I just wanted to be a paler yellow and maybe just a little bit of white here and there. And you can see basically where the inside of the twists were. So I have a few options. I can leave it like this, and I might just do that and see how it knits up because it can be totally fun. The one dye experiment that I did years ago is this one right here. And that's when I did that on purpose because I wanted the colors to break out of the purple and see how that worked out. So whatever I knit or crocheted that up into, I never got pictures of, so I don't remember. I do remember using it and it is super fun. So I might just do that with this because I just wanted something super fun and springy and all that fun stuff. For me, this is just part of the learning process and understanding different dyeing techniques. And that's why I think it is good to, you know, this vision that I have at the end to try to make that the goal, but also not get so hung up on this that like, I don't feel disappointed by this either, to be honest. So I don't know if I want to, I can always go back in. I do believe I have one yellow and one green tablet left, and I don't know if they're the same shades, but that could also be super fun. As far as this last bit, so there's about 90 grams left here. I was going to do something speckly here, except that the other flaw of the kit now is, well, especially because I was experimenting, I'm out of the colors that I would have wanted on here, and I'm just not loving the color combination of what's left of the color tablets. So that is a little bit of a flaw that you might end up with tablets of colors that you don't want anymore or that are left over. But I think they're good bite-size, you know, things to play with. And certainly, again, unless I did like a super diluted one of the other tablet colors, I don't think there's going to be enough color or dye to do an entire skein. Well, this is 90 grams, but essentially an entire skein of yarn. So that is something to keep in mind. And if you're willing to do multiple kits and have that, I do think the convenience of the tablets made it so much less messy. It might be worth it. I don't know. I don't know if like I love the kits or if I hate the kits for this purpose, because then I went to go look at the Wilton colors for, you know, in the jars, and clearly Walmart is clearancing them out, which tells me they're not going to carry them anymore. But also then I was like, but I'm just going to have so much of colors left over that I don't know that I want that much of those colors left over for one or two little projects. So it may not be the worst thing to pick up a couple of these Easter kits if you happen to like the colors that came in it and how everything turned out at the end. I would love to hear your thoughts on how you thought this experiment went, and if you're going to try it for yourself, or if you didn't like any of the colors that came in the kit, or what you would do differently. If you would make paler colors, do some color mixing. There's so many options and opportunities with, you know, learning how to dye yarn and using an inexpensive kit like this to just play around with it and see if it's something you would even enjoy, because I know it's hard to, I mean, for myself especially, go into a new part of a hobby because this is kind of an offshoot hobby, and you know, you want to try it, but then you want to spend the money, but you don't want to spend the money in case you don't like it. So I've run into that before too. And like, there's a few abandoned hobbies that I spent more on than I would care to admit. But I personally thought it was super fun and totally worth 98 cents or $1.98 or $3.98 for a few evenings of fun and just playing around with color and coming up with stuff that I know I'm going to enjoy and love. Today's feel-good story comes to us from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, from an Eaton Park, where a woman, Tammy, and her son, who was about 10 years old, they visited this Eaton Park, and their waitress, they discovered, was 81 years old and unable to retire because, as you can imagine, she is on a limited income, and She just connected with this woman and got some great life advice from her. And after she left the restaurant, she just felt compelled to start a GoFundMe and go to TikTok and raise over $325,000 so that Betty could actually retire and enjoy her golden years of life. And I just think that's an awesome story and one of the best uses of social media of all time. And as always, I had so much fun hanging out with you today, and I cannot wait to visit with you in the next one. Bye.